All right, everyone, it looks like our number of attendees have leveled out for the moment, so I'm going to get us started this morning. My name is Franny Noble, and I'm a specialist with Save the Children in our research department. I work on IDELA-related projects to communication, the website, and content that's coming in from our IDELA partners around the world. I'm hosting the webinar today alongside my colleague who's in the room with me here, Renee. She'll also be on the line. And let me walk you through a few administrative things before we begin. First of all, the webinar this morning is being recorded. I believe I legally have to warn you all of that. And we'll have it online posted on our website for all of you to be able to access the slides, the presentations, and all of the audio later on for your colleagues who weren't able to join us. Our agenda this morning includes an introduction, a presentation of report findings. We'll then move into a panel discussion and finally a Q&A. I want to let everyone on the line know that our attendees today will not have audio, the ability to speak to the group, and so primary communication for you should be through the chat box. If you have any questions, those will be monitored. And during the Q&A session, we'll also have a Q&A box appear, and you can input questions there as well. So feel free to use those methods to let us know if you need anything or if you have any questions for our panelists. To begin this morning, we have an introduction from Evelina Borisova, who is an early learning specialist at UNICEF in New York, where she works with UNICEF's global network to strengthen education systems with an emphasis on early education. She comes from a strong academic background with a PhD from Harvard University's Graduate School of Education in the Department of Human Development and Psychology. Her previous role at Save the Children, Eva supported country teams around the world to create and implement high-quality early learning programs. Eva was also involved in the development of IDELA and was central to the work to assess IDELA's structure and validity. She's a strong advocate for data collection to inform policy and programming in early childhood development, and we're grateful to have her here today to open our conversation on ECD and equity. Thank you.
Thanks, Franny. So let me see if I can now share my screen. Looks like it's gonna let me do that. PowerPoint up? Yes?
Yep. Yeah.
Fantastic, great. Good morning, everyone. It's very nice to be on this webinar and very nice to see some of you, those who have the cameras on. And for the rest of you, I hope I know some of you, and it's really nice to reconnect in this way. On behalf of UNICEF, we're very pleased to be able to contribute to the report and also to this webinar through the foreword that we provided. And it's really a pleasure to be able to kind of put the report in a little bit of a global context. As you know, UNICEF works in over 173 countries, and this focus on early childhood education is quite critical for us, and it's something that our country offices and our work around the world is really focusing on as well. So without further ado, I'm going to put a few slides up around the global context for this issue of early childhood education and try to provide the context for the recommendations of the report. I think if you're on this webinar, you probably are pretty convinced of the importance of early childhood education, or so we hope. But let me just say that I think we're pretty clear that the evidence is there why early childhood education matters. The evidence is also clear why it matters not only for children and for the outcomes that it supports across the child's continuum, but the evidence is also clear why it helps education systems as well as societies in large to really prosper and do better. Besides these wide-reaching evidence that's there for early childhood education, we also have the Sustainable Development Goals in our background as a way to remind us and to put a little bit more pressure on the policymakers for the importance of investing in early childhood education and in early years at large. And I think, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the SDG goals. There's a particular target on universal quality pre-primary education of at least 1 year, which I think is a pretty exciting time for this work, given that I think in the last decade we've been building the evidence, we've been creating the case for this, and now we also have finally a target that pushes ministers of education and other ministries to really put more effort into this area. So for us, and I think for Save the Children and for many of our partners that we work with, we're no longer kind of in stuck in the conversation of why it matters. I think we're moving into, in a way, the more difficult part of the conversation, which is how do we make sure that we provide these quality services to more children? And I think even more so for UNICEF and Save the Children, I know the issue of equity is really the critical one. And while we look at the universal agenda for pre-primary education, what we're really trying to solve is how do we make sure that children who need those services most are first in line to receive them and are prioritized by not only governments, but also by partners and communities on the ground. So I think with this evidence and with this push through the SDGs, there's a lot of really good momentum in this work that we're seeing from UNICEF's side, and I think many of you partners working in the field could probably attest to that. And yet, I think when we look at our challenges in moving this agenda forward, we are finding some pretty big obstacles that we have to work through. And I'll talk about the three main obstacles that are also part of the recommendations of this report. If we think about the main one, which is access, and I know we always start with access, where we are now is that we have less than half of the preschool age children in early learning opportunities of any kind. We're not even talking about the quality of these opportunities. We're pretty much just looking at how many kids have access to these opportunities. And unfortunately, when we look at more closely at who those children are, who do have access, we realize that the majority of them are not the ones who probably would benefit the most from them. And in low-income countries, we know, for example, that only 2 in 10 children are accessing early learning programs. And based on some of the recent work that UNICEF is doing and recent analysis that we're doing through the mixed survey, we're also finding that poorest kids are 8 times less likely to be attending early learning programs compared to some of their rich peers. So while we're halfway there, which is the positive part of the story, I think when we turn that around from an equity perspective, I think we're actually not halfway there. We're really far from some of those disadvantaged children that needs to be reached first. And then when we look at just projections between now and 2030, which is where we're trying to push the policymakers to have a vision for how they're reaching this universal target, we'll also see that low and low middle income countries, continuing on the current trends, are not going to be reaching the universal target with the current efforts that they're putting. So I think we already know that we have a big challenge in terms of access. We know that we have to shift the dial a little bit and potentially accelerate support and accelerate the work that we're doing in some of the countries that need more support, but we also know that the way that we need to be doing the work in country needs to be different. And we'll talk a little bit in a minute about some of the recommendations coming from the report. So let me turn at the second big challenge that I think we have. And of course, access is always linked to financing. I think it's very hard to accelerate access if we don't have sufficient investment in this area. And part of the challenge so far is that what you're seeing here, as I'm trying to animate the slide, is governments in the majority of the low and low income countries are spending substantially lower amounts on pre-primary education compared to other subsectors in the education system more broadly. So these are countries in sub-Saharan Africa for which data is available, and you can see that the majority of them are spending under 2% of their education budgets on pre-primary education, despite the amazing evidence that we already have as to why investment in these early years matters the most. Compare that to what they're spending on primary, secondary, and tertiary. I think we have our story pretty clear that education budgets currently don't prioritize pre-primary education, and there's a lot of work that we need to do to increase investment, which would in turn increase the capacity of governments to reach some of those hard-to-reach populations. And then the final challenge, probably the most critical when we get past the access part, is of course quality. And I think this report actually does a really great job at highlighting how critical that quality aspect of early learning really is. And I think we all know that the success of these programs really hinges on having a trained educator, a trained teacher in those classrooms, knowing what developmentally appropriate practice looks like, being able to support children in the way that they need to be supported, and being able to bring those amazing playful and active learning methodologies to light, which is really what creates the momentum for the success of these programs. And just a very quick statistic from our global report that we're working on is that in the majority of low-income countries, we have less than half of the pre-primary teachers trained compared to double that in the primary education sector. That, coupled with the fact that we actually are facing a pretty substantial pre-primary education teacher crisis, simply because we don't have a lot of those professionals trained and professionalize the way that some of the other parts of the education systems do. I think we have a pretty big challenge on our hands to trying to solve as we move forward with accelerating this work. And I think we have to be pretty creative, and there's a lot of important innovations and ideas that I know colleagues at Save the Children and other partners are testing out to really expand the workforce in the most meaningful and thoughtful way. So I think with that, I'm going to move now to the 3 key recommendations that, of course, are also linked to what I've been discussing so far from a global perspective. And I think from our read, this report helps shed light on a lot of critical issues that I think are helping us start to see the nuances of the context within which we're trying to move this agenda forward. Of course, UNICEF works very closely with governments and ministers of education, and a lot of them really are looking for this kind of evidence and for data that supports why they should be doing work in a certain way. And I think the findings of this report really help to provide that background and kind of nuanced understanding of what they should be doing slightly differently. I think the first recommendation is really focused on highlighting the fact that as children enter primary classrooms in grade 1, we have a very wide range of skill set that we're dealing with. And I think a fascinating finding from the report, which I'm sure Lauren will also talk about, is that less than 1/3 of children transitioning into primary school at the age of 6 actually do have the foundational skills that they need in both literacy, numeracy, and social-emotional development to succeed in primary school. Well, for us, this is an astounding finding, because what that tells us is that the majority of grade 1 students entering the primary school systems are really behind already and are lacking these key foundations. So from a recommendation perspective, what we really want to highlight is that education systems not only need to be focusing on, of course, making those opportunities available to children and making sure that they are supporting these foundational skills in an effective way, but even more importantly, perhaps, is making the early grades be aware of what students are entering their systems and how they need to support that transition, so that those 2/3 of students who are lacking foundational skills are able to accelerate and catch up and actually make meaningful progress in the early grades. And we're seeing this across from the learning crisis perspective. We know that this is a big contributor to why kids are not reading at grade level at the grade 3, for example. So this is massively important in creating that continuity and understanding of what kids need in the first year of primary school. Excuse me. I'm going to move on to the second recommendation, which is really focused on equity. And again, I think both UNICEF and Save the Children are highly passionate about this issue, because we really want to highlight this for governments, that as they work on expansion plans, as they work on making these services more available, what they really need to be doing is putting an equity lens to their planning. We very well know that universalizing pre-primary education will take a very long time, because systems are not built overnight. Financing is not available from today to tomorrow. But we know that there are efforts right now in many of the countries. We also know that there's some funding available for this work and some commitment on the ground from partners as well. And it's our strong belief that I think that funding and those efforts need to be channeled first to those who need them most. And I think this report does a pretty good job highlighting that in fact is critical, and that is the case given the big gap that we're seeing between poor and rich children, children from rural versus urban areas, and those are the children who actually need to kind of catch up as quickly as possible, so that the achievement gaps are much smaller as they progress through the education systems. So I think closing the gap in terms of equity through the way that governments and partners plan on the ground is critical. But in addition to that, there's an equity gap in terms of quality. Of course, even when services are available for those marginalized children, what we're seeing is that the quality of those services tends to be much lower compared to services that children in kind of well-off communities tend to have. And I think that's also important policy recommendation in ensuring that the quality of services as they're being scaled up remains uniform, and that there are systems and mechanisms in place to safeguard key aspects of quality that we know drive progress for children. That's easier said than done, but I think it's really, really important to keep that in mind as we work with our partners on the ground. And finally, moving towards the third recommendation, again, recognizing that a lot of Save the Children's work and a lot of the work of partners like Plan International and UNICEF as well is really trying to bridge the conversation between systems and homes and communities. We know that children don't only learn in schools. In fact, the majority of their learning and development perhaps happens in the context of homes and supportive communities. And we know that trajectory starts at birth and continues on past the 8 years, though of course from an early childhood development perspective, we are focused in the first 8 years of life. And in best case scenario, these supports available at home and supports available through quality organized programs truly complement each other and create a very supportive and blended environments where children can develop the skills that they need in order to achieve success in school and beyond. Unfortunately, what we're finding is that, of course, in the absence of organized early learning program, family support becomes that much more critical. So it's really, really important to keep in mind that learning and opportunities children have available at home. And even in the context of organized early learning programs, that added value of family engagement and support really creates the momentum and push that oftentimes makes a huge difference for children. So I think keeping in mind the fact that children are not developing in a vacuum, I think the key policy recommendation that's coming out of this report is that education systems really need to think more carefully and critically, how can they connect to the learning in the system that children have outside of the school? How do we meaningfully engage with parents, with families, with caregivers of those young children? And how do we bring them into the system in a way in those early years that can then sustain the engagement of families over the education trajectory of children, which of course is actually critical, not only in the early years, but also in primary and primary education and beyond. So I think for us, this is really important. And I think it also creates an opportunity for more creative ways to also program in these early years, because there's a lot of innovations that support ways that parents can be involved in the learning and education of their children as early as possible. Finally, I think I'm going to put the access and quality into a broader system focus. I think we've been talking about the importance of governments keeping in mind issues related to equitable access, issues related to quality, issues related to investment. I think for us, and I think this is a quick snapshot of something UNICEF has been working on to encourage partners in ministries of education to really take a comprehensive view of this issue of access and quality, where we're no longer just talking about increasing the number of kids who have access to pre-primary education, but we're really helping ministries and governments and policymakers understand what they need to put in place for that access to drive results. And again, going back to the quality pieces, we know we need very good curriculum that's appropriate for children. We know we need trained educators that are able to deliver in classrooms. We know we need the support of families and communities. And we also know that we need accountabilities, and we need systems to feel incentivized and to feel accountable for results for children. And of course, putting the resources in the right places, that's what you see in that middle circle. I think those elements coming together could help safeguard not only the quality elements that we've discussed, as well as the equity elements in terms of access, but it could also really create a sustainable systems around these early learning services that can last much longer than projects or independent initiatives that are often happening on the ground right now. I think this report does a pretty good job at highlighting the importance of taking a broad perspective on these issues, and as well as keeping some of these important nuances in mind as we move forward. And I think very importantly, it really reminds us that in order to really know how strong these programs are, we need to be looking at data, and we need to be looking at how we're tracking children's learning. And we need to be holding governments and partners accountable if their programs actually are delivering results for children. And I think we're getting better at that. I think certainly the work through IDELA and some of the other measures out there are helping us to have better understanding of how effective our programs are at delivering results. And I think it would be fantastic to hear more about the report now that we have Lauren coming up next. I think that's it. I hope this helped create a little bit of a broader perspective. And again, thank you so much for the opportunity to be a part of this webinar.
Eva, thank you so much. I'm so glad you could be with us this morning and give us that perspective.
My pleasure. Thank you again.
You're very welcome. Next on our agenda is the report presentation, and this is coming from Lauren Pisani, who is an advisor for learning research at Save the Children US. Lauren has worked across Africa, Asia, and Central America, leading training and data collection for basic education and early childhood education programs. Lauren's been instrumental in the development, training, and growth of IDELA over the last years. And recently she's worked with the government of Bhutan to complete a national ECZ study and supported Bhutan's investment in a national preschool program. Lauren's the primary author of the report, and she's here now to give us an inside look at the findings.
Thank you, Franny, and thank you everyone for joining this webinar today. Let me see if I can get my slides up and running. Hopefully you can see this. Let's go. Franny, give me a nod if this looks okay. Or somebody. Okay, great, thank you, thumbs up. Okay, so I'm really excited to be sharing the results of this analysis with you all this morning, or this afternoon, or this evening, wherever you are. As Franny mentioned, we have a lot of great things in store for this discussion and a lot of great panelists. So I'm going to try to keep my comments brief, but give a few highlights of what we learned from this report. And I have to thank Eva for the great introduction, because that really does help situate a lot of what we were thinking when we undertook this analysis. So before I dig into the results, I want to give you a few details about the data that we used and our research questions to give you some frame for our thinking as we dug into this analysis and the report. So as I hope a lot of you know, we launched the IDELA Network website in September 2017. So it's about 9 months ago now, which is kind of crazy to think about. Time really does fly. But the IDELA website for us was something that was so much anticipated, because it really opens the doors for greater engagement with partners around the world who are using the IDELA tool. And right from the get-go, we had partners sharing data, sharing reports, sharing their lessons learned from using this tool. And so we've been already starting to learn so much, and we're not even a year in. So what we thought would be really interesting is if we gathered all of this new information that we were receiving and produced a report that looked at, what we're really starting to learn about what children know and can do at this critical age of 3 to 6 before they're entering primary school. And as you can see from the little map here, we selected 38 of the data sets that have been shared with the IDELA website to dig into this analysis. You can read the full report for more details on how we chose these data sets, but basically it was those that had the most complete information. And they came from Save the Children country offices. They also came from a number of partner organizations. And there were 4 different sites that were coming from partners or groups who were working with children in crisis and conflict settings. And I'll get into a little bit more of this later, but we were really happy to see that these children who are some of the most vulnerable in the world are represented in our analysis as well. And you can see country profiles for all of these different sites up on the IDELA website if you haven't looked there already. So when we were gathering this data and thinking about our research questions, what we wanted to do was take a new perspective on, I think, a question that a lot of people are already asking. And this very much builds on the points that Eva was making, so I have to thank her for the great introduction. There are a lot of statistics out there about the need for increasing access or increasing funding that are kind of high-level statistics for a number of different sites. But what we realize with IDELA, the opportunity that it gives us is to really dig deeper and learn more about what young children know and can do. Because as a direct child assessment, IDELA gives us really rich information about young children's skills in these different areas, and that's something that's very unique and that doesn't exist from other tools out there, especially at the global scale that IDELA is now being used with. So our questions were really about better understanding children's growth and development over time. So how do their skills change with age as they mature? What do those skills look like across the different developmental domains as they're about to enter primary school? Because of course that has a lot of implications for both early childhood education systems and primary education systems. And then critically, what are the components of children's environments that are driving or perhaps hindering their development? So really taking this equity lens and seeing what we can learn about the conditions in which children are developing and how that's affecting their learning and growth. So without much further ado, let's dig into some of the top level results of the report. And again, all of the results are in the full report, so I hope everyone can take the time to dig into that as well, but I'm happy to share a few highlights here today. So one of the first things that struck us when we started asking this question of how children's skills change as they mature and grow older was that there's a huge variety in the skills that children display, even within age groups. So the figure you're seeing here shows the distribution of total IDELA scores for the 20,000 children that were in our sample from age 3 to age 7. So we've got age 3 in kind of red here on the left, and it goes from left to right, 4, 5, 6, and 7-year-olds are in blue. And you can see that for each of these age groups, especially the 4 and the 5-year-olds, and even the 7-year-olds actually, there's a huge range of the skills that children are displaying. And this was a huge eye-opener for us because it really highlights the fact that children are coming from very diverse experiences in their early lives that mean that their engagement with early academic skills across these different domains is quite different, and we can't assume that all children are coming into learning environments with the same understanding or with the same backgrounds. And so when we dug deeper into this to think about that critical transition of children into primary school, we took a look at 6-year-olds in particular. So this is the age about which children are transitioning into primary school in a lot of education systems. So we wanted to see what skills children displayed at this point. And we found that less than a third of children were displaying what we defined as mastery of these early learning skills. So the definition is for the purpose of this report, and other different communities or different education systems might interpret their results differently based on their curriculum. But what we called mastering was children who were scoring 75% correct or better on any of these domains or on the total IDELA assessment. So that means that they're answering 3 out of 4 questions correctly or better. So we felt like they're really showing comfort and proficiency with these different early learning skills. You can see that the bulk of the children are in this dark purple color, which we are calling emerging. And that means that they were scoring from 25% to 74% correct on the assessment, which in practice, and you can look into the report actually for some more details about what this means tangibly on the different skills, but children are starting to develop some of these early learning skills, but they probably have strengths in some areas, and then also they could use more support in some other areas. And then there was a smaller proportion of children who we were defining, for lack of a better word, as struggling. And these are children who scored less than 25% correct on the different domains or on the total IDELA score. And that's less than 1 out of 4 of these questions correct. So we felt like these children at age 6 especially were really struggling to engage with the content of the assessment, such that it was going to make their transition into primary school probably quite difficult. We'll get into the implications of this, I think, a little bit later in our discussion, but this was quite an interesting finding for us. So after we were looking at the children's skills overall and this transition into primary school, we really wanted to tackle this question of equity and what we were seeing in terms of differences and drivers of children's learning and development. Across the 38 data sets, we have gender variables for everyone. So we were able to look across all of the data to see where we were seeing advantages or differences between young boys and young girls. And what we see is that overall, there were not a lot of significant differences between the skills of young boys and young girls in the different domains. But in the cases that there were significant differences between the skills, the advantage tends to be in the favor of girls. So especially in the emergent literacy domain and the motor domain, which for IDELA is pretty heavily weighted towards fine motor skills, we see girls have a pretty consistent advantage, or they're more likely to show a significant difference over their male peers. And then for the area of emergent numeracy, we saw boys and girls were equally likely to have an advantage across different sites. And while there really isn't a lot published about the differences across contexts in terms of boys and girls' early skills, some of these results link pretty nicely to what we see for older children in global assessments. For example, the PISA tends to show a pretty consistent advantage for girls in literacy over boys, and at an older age group, PISA is 15-year-old children, there's a marginal advantage for boys in terms of numeracy. But the bigger picture, I think, is that we're seeing that young girls are doing quite well on these early assessments. And even as they get older, they continue to do well on academic type assessments, but we know that they don't progress as successfully through education systems. They are graduating at lower rates and different things like that. So I think we have a real question to ask about what's happening in our education systems from between early childhood to, say, the end of secondary school that's hindering the success of girls. So then we dug deeper into a smaller proportion of our data sets. We had 12 of the 38 data sets that had an accompanying caregiver questionnaire. So in addition to doing the IDELA survey, they also interviewed parents and asked them about their home environments and the learning environments that children have. So we were able to really do more detailed analyses of the influences of these different home environments on children's learning and development. And the first slide here is where we were looking at the different assets that parents reported having in their homes and how that's influencing children's learning and development. So we looked at the socioeconomic status of parents, and for us that was measured through home possessions or assets. And we also looked at the variety of child-friendly reading and toys that parents report having in their homes. And interestingly, we saw a very consistent relationship, significant relationship between the variety of home learning materials and children's learning and development. So in 8 out of these 12 data sets, there was a significant relationship between the learning materials and children's development. And then in 4 of the 12 data sets, there was a significant relationship between the home possessions and children's development. And the figure here is a little bit different, so I just want to take a second to describe what you're seeing on the slide. The circles here correspond to different data sets. And the size of the circle corresponds to the size of the data set. So bigger data sets have larger circles and smaller samples have smaller circles on these figures. This is displaying the significant results from these analyses. And the axis on the left side of the figure is showing the the results translated into months of development. So for each additional home possession or toy or reading material, how much does it boost children's learning and development? So for example, the red circle you see on the top of the home learning materials column, that's relatively large. That's telling us that there was a large data set, so more than 2,000 children, where there was a significant relationship between reading materials and toys at home and children's development. And more specifically, one additional reading material or toy was related to almost 4 additional months of development as measured by IDELA. So that was some really interesting results. Of course, you can see the magnitude of the relationship between these background variables, and IDELA scores varied from site to site. It was really neat to see the consistency of the relationship, even though maybe the size of the relationship differed. And so then the second part of this analysis was to dig into the relationships or the activities that are happening in children's homes. So we looked at home learning activities and harsh discipline. And home learning activities we're defining as reading stories, playing games, telling stories, taking children outside, anything that is early learning or responsive to young children in the home. So it's caregiver interactions with their kids. And harsh discipline is things like hitting, spanking, yelling, those sorts of things. And not so surprisingly, we see that the more responsive home learning activities that children experience, and the less harsh discipline they experience, the more their early learning and development is promoted. So similarly here, you can see there were 6 data sets out of the 12 where we saw a significant relationship between the home learning activities and children's development. And there were 3 data sets out of the 12 where we saw a significant negative relationship between harsh discipline and children's development. And again, the magnitude of those relationships was different across the different data sets, but they're all displayed pretty clearly here, which was another interesting thing for us to see, and something I hope we can dig into more in our discussion and in feedback and comments from you all. So in terms of next steps, we did this analysis and we obviously learned a lot, but we came away wanting even more. Because as much as this IDELA report was a deeper dive into children's learning and development than we typically see from other assessments or other reports that are out there about early learning and development, there are certain groups of children who we feel that we need to know more about. So the figure here is the distribution of IDELA scores for children who are living in these displaced or conflict settings. And if you remember way back to the first slide I showed you of the distribution of scores by age, it looks pretty similar, that children are coming into these early learning environments with quite a variety, a range of knowledge and experiences. But we know that children in these high stress conflict settings have a lot of needs that are probably not represented by something like an average IDELA score. So we really want to push more data collection, or advocate for more data collection in these types of settings, because even something like doing an IDELA assessment or another assessment of early learning helps us be more accountable to the quality of these programs and to really think deeply about the services that these kids are receiving. But there's more to be done, especially qualitative work and engagement with family and communities. There's a lot we need to understand about the specific needs of children who are experiencing these really high levels of stress, especially for years on end in some of these camps and different situations. So that's something that we hope we can continue to dig into with partners over time. In conclusion, before we get to our discussion, I just want to say that some of our big takeaways were that this 3 to 5 year age band we know is a really critical period of brain development for young children, but it's also a really vulnerable stage where there's often a lack of services. Children tend to have access to health services when they're quite young, or their mothers do, through different initiatives of the health system. And then, of course, when they become 6 or older, the primary education system is providing a lot of educational services. But this 3 to 5 year range tends to be a gap in services, especially in low and middle income countries or in poorer communities where services tend to be weaker in general. But we know that failing to invest in this critical time period is really going to harm the long-term development and success that children can have, both in education systems and more generally in their lives. I mean, that's what the research is telling us. So we really need to think about investing sustainably and also equitably. As Eva mentioned, the investments that already occur are, I mean, they're growing, but they're still insufficient, and there needs to be more progressive investment towards the children who need the support most. So when we're thinking about progress towards Sustainable Development Goal 4.2, just talking about access on an average is not going to be enough. We really need to dig into access for whom, and most importantly, we need to talk about quality for everyone, and it's got to be front and center from the beginning. So those are some of our big takeaways. I'm excited to start hearing about some of the experiences from our panelists, and then some more questions from you all on this report, hopefully today and then in an ongoing way. So thank you everyone for joining, and thank you everybody, especially our panelists who are coming up next, who are going to dig into more their IDELA work and share some of the great lessons learned that they've been sharing with us, with you all. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Lauren, fantastic. Thank you so much. I think the one downside to this webinar hosting method is you don't get to hear any applause at the end, but I want to let you know it was great to hear you and great to hear the results presented in that format. We've been working on the printed version of the report for quite a while now, and so it's great to hear the same information presented in a different way. As Lauren mentioned, before we start our panelists, I do want to mention this report is available online currently on the IDELA website. So please go there, check it out. And as you hear from other panelists, their work is available on our website as well. That's idela-network.org. And I'll be putting that up on the screen in a few moments as well. We're now transitioning into the panelist portion of our webinar, and I'm thrilled to introduce 3 IDELA colleagues who have joined us today, and who you can see hopefully on your screens there. Each of them is going to provide a short introduction to their work. I'll introduce them, and then we're going to jump into a panel discussion. So let me get their slides up so you have a visual as well. Great. All right, our first presenter is Luke Henkel. He joins us from Results for Development. He's used IDELA for his work and Results for Development's work in Serbia, and he's currently a senior program officer with R4D. Luke, take it away.
Thank you very much. I will try to be brief, and I'll apologize right away for text-heavy slides. It's so hard to get it down to 3. So let me just briefly tell you about Results for Development. We're a nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C. I'm currently based in Australia, and we'll be back there shortly. And we are an organization that is trying to generate evidence in order to, do good in the world. We work with partners in Serbia on this specific challenge, which I phrase here, which is that Roma mothers and children have less access to early childhood education and health resources, and that leads to disparities in school readiness and health outcomes. So the partners are the Program for Children and Families, Strong from the Start, Dem Len Faka. It's a very long name, and it is a partnership between Romani Pen, which is an organization that is led by members of the Roma community, and the Center for Interactive Pedagogy, which is in Belgrade, which is a team of psychologists, and they collaboratively developed this Strong from the Start curriculum. In the right-hand side of the screen, you can see that this curriculum covers 3 thematic areas. There are 20+ workshops that happen for the parents and children, and then there are 10 joint workshops that they have as well. So that's actually a fairly low dose, less than 2 workshops per month, typically happening, every other Saturday or so. This was funded by the Open Society Foundation, and it was piloted in 3 communities in Serbia from 2012 to 2015, and then scaled to 15 communities last year. So you can go to the next slide, Franny. I do not run programs for early childhood. I run evaluations. So our work, we were asked to come in to see if we could, prove that this program worked or not. We were happy to be the objective researchers in this case. Develop a big sample. We include everybody that participated in the program, and we select 15 comparison communities to go with. So this is a big effort, and we did a baseline in March of last year. We did a mid last year, which I kind of call N1, because some people so the very simple and children. The outcomes we looked at were both parent knowledge, attitude, and behavior, but also the child's school readiness. And I wanted to just note that we particularly focused on socio-emotional development. So when we set up an evaluation, there are hundreds of data points. And so if you go fishing hard enough, you're going to find something interesting. So to keep it objective, we said, let's pick one data point, one indicator to prove this program or not. And we worked together with partners, and we decided that socio-emotional development was the most important outcome that they hope to see from the program. And in fact, the program implementers even take issue with this concept of school readiness as a goal. For them, it's all about that socio-emotional development. So we can go to the next slide. The good news is when we think about equity that our midline results already are showing a statistically significant change in child development, not just on that socio-emotional development that we wanted to see, but also on early literacy and numeracy. This is particularly cool to see because this, like I said, this program doesn't really activity that, academic focus, but it's bringing them in. In terms of equity, I think this, an important point, the Roma community is completely marginal, literally not list half of the time, so they're not even eligible for preschool. And so this is all about equity. It's all about proving that these kids can learn and providing and filling a service gap that is much needed in the Serbian context. I also just wanted to mention in terms of equity that, I think the culturally sensitive program and also evaluation design increase the likelihood of success, first in a program that worked, but then also in being able to accurately evaluate the program. The photo on the below is our data collection team. It's 50% Roma, and so we had members of the community working with trained enumerators to do the data collection. And so of course the program itself is certainly a blend of expertise, and even the evaluation was as well. And so it's already gaining a lot of interest from folks like the World Bank and Serbia's Ministry of Education, Science, and Technological Development. So we're off to a good start with the program, and I'll leave it at that for now.
Fantastic. Thanks, Luke. Our next panelist, if I can get my slides working here. Our next panelist is Gauri Kirtane. She comes from FSG in India and is an ECE expert. I will let her explain India's affordable private school program.
Thanks, Franny. I ask you to move to the next slide. Perfect, thank you. So everyone, I'm Gauri Kirtane Vanikar, and I'm part of FSG's program to private education, which for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to call PIPE. So the program aims to improve learning outcomes for children in affordable private schools in urban India. And we're doing this by bringing in and supporting proven providers who use play or activity or experience-based learning solutions. PIPE's work is with the urban working poor population, which we have defined as families with a monthly household income of between 140 and 315 US dollars. Now, this section comprises nearly 70% of urban India. A research study carried out by PIPE in 2015 with nearly 4,500 households across 8 cities showed that over 90% of children in this particular population are actually attending preschools. A majority of them are accessing private provisions. We found that 86% of these children are actually going to what we've called affordable private schools or APSs. And an APS that charges, so that's in much better quality of education to in order to ensure that to a strong educational preschool year. Unfortunately, APSs predominantly use a very rote memorization based approach, and learning outcomes in APSs are almost as poor as in government schools. So, Prani, if we can move to slide 2. That means slide 3, the following slide. Yeah, thanks. So, PIPE actually adapted, translated, and used the IDELA to understand learning levels and learning gaps in children who are entering primary school in grade 1. So these are children who had a formal. So to adapt the two count, and while what in the context, there were a few expectations of children in grade 1. And so we have a panel of experts who are consulting for us. We added in a few developmentally appropriate relevant questions in addition to the core IDELA questions. We translated the tool and then we piloted it and then refined the tool based on the pilots. The study that we conducted using the IDELA was done across 408 students who were from 25 schools in 4 cities in India. And the study showed that despite attending private English medium schools, these children were largely unable to speak in English or show phonological awareness. We found learning gaps in math and numeracy, and especially so in tasks requiring application and cognitive flexibility, which kind of takes us back to the very rote learning approach that these schools follow with very little focus on concept mastery or understanding. And I think these findings truly helped us identify high quality activity based solutions. So what we're doing is, like I said in the beginning, we're actually pulling in existing providers who have high quality activity based solutions and bringing them into the affordable preschools or affordable private schools. And the second outcome is, because we got into this research, it's also initiated a discussion around learning gaps in affordable private schools. The dialogue is usually around gaps in government school systems, and the affordable private school system, although a burgeoning and large part of the school system, is ignored. So I think the discussion around this space was also initiated as a result of the baseline that we using the IDELA. If we move into the following slide. Yeah, so how does this actually tie into equity? Like I mentioned, this is 70% of urban India's population, which is huge. And we found, like I said, 86% of these families are actually attending affordable private schools. They truly believe that these schools are helping them change and access better education, and that's not coming about. So what we are hoping is, if you look at the little diagram at the bottom, and here I'm going to refer to what Eva brought up also, which is a third recommendation, the importance of the family. Children don't learn in a vacuum. So we have a solution provider. The solution provider actually works on methodologies, works with the teacher by bringing, learning solutions into the classroom, training and equipping the teacher, which improves the teaching and learning environment, therefore directly impacting the child. The solution provider is also working with the parent through parent engagement sessions, because what we realized is right now, when we spoke to these parents in these 4,500 interviews, parents were using incorrect ways of understanding learning. So they would typically ask a child to recite numbers or say the alphabet, and that's not truly an indicator of learning. So it was important for parents to also see why it's different. It's important to change the approach that the school is using, and simultaneously understand how they can support the child at home. So that's kind of the theory of change that PIPE is working with. So we are leveraging existing stakeholder motivations and hoping that the program can improve learning outcomes for over 200,000 children from low-income households in urban India. If you have any questions or any further information that you would like about the program, you can visit our site, which is www.fsg.org/pipe. Yeah. So I'm going to stop at that and we can get to questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. And to highlight a little bit more from our report, we actually featured Gary's work in the Beyond Access report. So if you would like to read more about her work, yes, the website is a fantastic resource, and it's also in this most recent report. So please check that out. Our last panelist is Ali Amente. He is an ECCE program coordinator for Save the Children International in Ethiopia. He's been working with IDELA for a number of years and has helped promote IDELA with Ethiopian partners as well.
Thank you, Franny. And hi, everybody. As she mentioned, I'm Ali from Ethiopia. I'm supporting a sponsorship program, but mainly IDELA implementation in Ethiopia since 2013. So IDELA in Ethiopia, let me briefly introduce you the background of IDELA in Ethiopia. So IDELA initially introduced in 2030 at 36 ECCD centers, but currently it is being implemented in several regions. These regions are 3 development regions or stable regions, then 1 pastoral region, and 3 emerging contexts. When I say emerging context, it means the refugee setting. So this time IDELA is getting expanded throughout Ethiopia, starting from 36 centers. So teachers from more than 500 centers from all these regions received training on early literacy and the maths toolkit. We are also conducted IDELA assessment in these regions. So IDELA being introduced to teachers training package at Government Teacher Training College. So as of last year, we are closely working with Ministry of Education at national level and at regional level, and we are becoming successful to introduce emerging literacy and the math toolkit to integrate in teacher training college. So providing that teacher will receive training on IDELA, emerging literacy and the maths toolkit before they leave the training college. So IDELA approach, or the emerging literacy and the maths approach and the methodology also integrated in the national early childhood care and education curriculum. So as of last year, we are fiercely working with Ministry of Education to include, the toolkit of emerging literacy and the maths in the national ECCE curriculum. So this year, the one we developed last year was under revision. So we got another opportunity to again integrate the emerging literacy and the maths activities and the methodologies and even its approach into the national curriculum. Franny, would you go to the next slide, please? So IDELA, from the data we got from IDELA, we believe that emerging literacy and the math is an equalizer. That means when we think of equity from our data, so more than 20,000 preschool children, especially from the remote part of the country and from the pastoral area and from the refugee camps, reached through this approach. So that we believe that IDELA is, emerging literacy approaches equalizing children from different contexts. The home learning environment, my observations are most absent in the they are the most and the best of their children. So that when we train teachers on train parent on literacy and on the way they support their children, so they realize that they are the best teacher of their children. So because of that, parents from the low socioeconomic status benefited their children by supporting their children at home. So this is what you observe from IDELA assessment. The other thing from the finding we got from since 2015 from different contexts show that girls are performing better than their counterpart, better than boys. So so IDELA, the implementation of emerging literacy and the math is providing good learning opportunity for girls. That's what we understand from the data. The other thing is quality enhancement. Maybe both Evelina and Lauren were mentioning that quality does matter. So in the Ethiopian context, for one thing, the preschool education program is very at embryonic stage. The other thing, the government has a 1-year program, which it calls O-class program. So through the emerging literacy and the maths implementation, the quality of this, the 1-year program is becoming enhanced. So this is what we really observed from the IDELA, from the IDELA data. So would you go to the next slide, please? So if you happen to look at these findings, this shows the baseline, the gain between the baseline and the end line for children from the low socioeconomic status and the high economic status. So as you can see from this one, that because of the parenting intervention and the center-based intervention for those group of children, so children from the low socioeconomic status gain good promising learning gain compared to the children from the high socioeconomic status. So from this we can understand that emerging literacy and the maths intervention is really equalizing children from parents of limited education and economic status with those group of children from educated parents and high socioeconomic status. Could you go to the next slide, please? So what we learned from our experience is that from the IDELA assessment, we can learn that parents' role really makes a difference, especially for the Ethiopian context. Government is not really reaching or expanding preschool education program into different contexts, so access to that program is still limiting. In that context, we can say that training parent on how to support their children at home really can make a difference. So until the program reach into different contexts and children, especially in the rural part of the country, really training parent on the emerging literacy and the parent toolkit really can make a difference. The other thing is quality does matter. Sending children to, even if there is the access to that program, sending children to the preschool education program does not matter. So it is good to work on the quality. So from our experience, we can see that the IDELA, from the IDELA data, we can see that where there is our intervention, so the quality really becoming improved. So the learning gain of the children is really becoming improved, so that teachers received training on how they can manage or teach children through developmentally appropriate teaching mechanism. So we can say that really IDELA, from the IDELA data, we can see that quality does matter. So this is, I think, maybe I can share more on the when questions can come up. Maybe if you go to the next slide, maybe this is the end of the slide. Thank you very much for your participation. Maybe if there are some questions, I can reflect on that. Oh, thank you for your attention.
Great, thank you very much, Ali. We are pressed for time, and I want to make sure we get to our discussion questions as well as save room for Q&A. So again, you're welcome to type questions into the chat box now if you want to kind of write them down and remember them. We are going to move on to discussion right now, and we'll save Q&A for the end. I'm going to turn it back over to Lauren to engage a little bit more with our panelists. Thanks, Lauren.
Awesome. Thank you, Franny. So we'll dig into a couple key questions that we have for our expert panelists. And then, as Franny mentioned, we'll open the floor to everyone for Q&A. But feel free to start typing questions in as you like. One of the first questions that came up for us from this report is about different ways for filling the service gap. So we see that there is a gap that exists for services for these 3 to 5-year-olds. And I'm wondering what our panelists are learning about different maybe innovative or creative ways of filling that service gap in their particular country context. And if they can speak to that, and maybe how some of these IDELA results are helping them learn more about the gaps or advocate to partners for filling these services in for the children who need them most. And I think one of the most interesting contexts that we were first hearing about was the private education provision in India from Gowrie. So I was wondering if you want to take a first stab at this, Gowrie, and then maybe our other panelists will also have a few comments.
Sure. All right, so just to reintroduce really quickly, like I said, we're working not with the poorest of the poor, but kind of with the next group, which are families earning anywhere between 140 and 315 US dollars a month. Very quickly, these are, peons in offices or clerks or helpers who are working in people's homes, drivers, chauffeurs, Uber drivers, etc. So that's the profile of parent, very aspirational. And like you found with the IDELA, when we used the IDELA in these schools, we found that the learning gaps were fairly huge, much more than we had expected them to be. Despite the fact that this is an English medium private provision. And we realized that a couple of the issues were stemming from the fact that this space is not governed by a law as yet. There are policy recommendations, but since there's no law in place, very often the teachers being hired are not necessarily qualified. The owners or principals kind of end up spending money on more gimmicky things to attract parents and admissions, but the focus is not truly on learning. We also realized that in the ecosystem, in the Indian early childhood space, there were a lot of providers who actually had very good products and service solutions to improve learning outcomes. Typically, they serviced the high-end market. They were selling to much higher-end schools. Our research revealed that a significant number of children are actually attending affordable private schools, and our rough estimate is there are between 120 to 150,000 affordable private schools in urban India. So, when we took this research to these providers and convinced them that A, there's a huge market, B, there's a need, and they're not doing this as a CSR initiative. This is actually a very sustainable profit-making endeavor for them. So I think we nudged the providers to make them aware about this entire market that was actually available. Second, we also worked with school owners and principals to get them a little more aware of the gaps that existed and these opportunities that could present themselves if the two could work together. So we've kind of stimulated both the supply and demand. The reason we went the reason we went down this route was we wanted this to be a scalable and a sustainable solution. And we felt that if, the different stakeholders were not seeing value in this, it could be something that lasted for a little bit and tapered off. But if all stakeholders actually saw value and we leveraged their existing motivations, this would indeed become something that was sustainable. So, we started out with about 34, 35 schools in the first year. Year 3 right now, we are close to 300 schools that are taking on programs and trying to effect change. So that's just one glimpse into what we're doing. Hopefully this helps start the discussion and take it further. But
Yeah.
basically, activity-based learning is in a lot of classrooms. Children's learning outcomes are showing improvement. Classroom environment is definitely showing change.
That's really terrific. And I think the idea of taking the supply side and the demand side and bringing them together is something that you guys are really pioneering. That's really wonderful. Thank you for the insights.
Thanks.
And so speaking of the service delivery gap and supply and demand from families, Ali, I think you mentioned some interesting innovations around home learning or ELM, early learning initiatives at home to work with parents. So I was wondering if you can speak a little bit about how you feel like these parenting programs might be filling this service gap, and especially if you see that increasing demand from parents for more of this early learning for their kids.
Yep. This time through sponsorship program, we are reaching many parents in different two impact areas. So from this, there is high demand from parents, so that they know that the 1 year preschool education program that the government is leading is really not reaching all the regions because of many limitations. Resources one problem. The government, because of that, the government is not really providing access to the 1 year program. So where our program is there, when we train parents on the ELM, emergent literacy and math at home, so they are very interesting, and they really realize that they can support their children at home and they can make a change. So that so far, because of low awareness and low knowledge around the support they could provide to their children at home, they don't know how to support their children at home. But when they after they receive the training on that package, they really become confident, and they realize that they can really support their children at home. So there is high demand from the parent side, but the problem is just to how can reach because of that there is resource limited, but through Save the Children only, it is not possible to reach all parents in the different corner of the country. But advocating this issue to the government, it is really possible to address the demand from the parent side.
That's great. That's great. And I think that you guys pioneering that and advocating for that engagement with parents, continuing on with the government the government of Ethiopia is doing a lot to invest in early childhood education. And it's necessarily slower in a big country like Ethiopia, but to continue to push that focus on quality and the focus on the connection with families, especially in this transition period where, like you were saying, the school-based services aren't reaching everyone. It's so important. So thank you for that great work. It's really great. Okay, so let's move to the next question. Another point that we've really been thinking about is lessons learned about equity, the equity of service delivery based on, and what maybe IDELA assessment results are telling you, or how you've used lessons learned to advocate to either your partners or governments, different groups. And I think one of the most clear service delivery and equity learning situations that we heard about today was from Luke in Serbia and serving Roma populations that, as he mentioned, are often just completely off the radar in a lot of these Eastern European countries. So Luke, I was wondering if you can speak a little bit to what you're learning about these service delivery gaps and how you're moving forward with that.
Yeah, and it's a great question. I think, the intent with this pilot and then this 2-year-long program was never to say that, that 5-year engagement was going to solve everything forever. From the moment they started designing this program, they were looking at the long game, which was how do you, develop a program that reaches a community that's incredibly difficult to reach, but then also how do we start proving that out to the government and to the big donors. And so that's where the evaluation came from. This was always linked, and we actually had a rare opportunity to present our findings within the Ministry of Education in Serbia. And it was not just me, but it was also the co-implementers, both the Roma NGO and also the team of psychologists. And so that made a pretty compelling group of folks. And of course, Open Society Foundation was there as well. So we were saying, here's a funder who believes in this, here's a team that is partnering in an innovative way, and here is an evaluator who's proving that this works. And so that combination, I think, points us towards something that can actually be more sustainable with uptake from the World Bank and from the government.
That's great. That's great. And I think that's something that we're starting to see in a couple other contexts too, where partners, either different NGO groups or funders and their partners are coming together and being able to use this evidence to bring a common voice to the government to say that, there's a lot of us digging into this issue. A lot of us find it really important. And you know what I mean? Like, this is what we recommend as way forward. So thank you for pioneering that in Serbia. That's fantastic. So I want to, actually, do any of the other panelists have anything to say on this topic? Service delivery and equity, anything you want to add to this question before we jump to our more open Q&A? Just trying to keep an eye on our time.
I don't.
Okay. So if our panelists are good, then I want to open the floor up to everyone who's been so patient on this webinar. And I know we have a few questions in our chat box already. So Franny and Renee, I'm going to turn it over to you to let us know what our first question is, and we can then direct that to our panelists.
Fantastic. So Renee has been monitoring the chat box, and I think everyone's been using that very well. So I'm not even going to open up the Zoom branded Q&A box. I think you all know where the chat box is and you've been using it. So please, if you do have additional questions, either for a particular person or the group, please feel free to put them there. We are monitoring that. Renee, what questions have been coming in?
Great.
Hello. All right, can everyone hear me?
Yep.
All right, so there are a few that are directed to specific people, as well as other questions that I think could elicit responses from the wider group. So we'll start off with the specific ones. So there was a question for Gowri on what kinds of additional developmentally appropriate questions did you pose?
So Renee, your sound wasn't too good, so I missed
Okay.
words from the question. Could you repeat that, please?
Can you hear me now?
Much better.
Okay, so the question was, what kind of additional developmentally appropriate questions did you ask?
Okay, so you're talking about the additions that we made to the tool?
Yes.
Yeah, I think
Yes.
so.
Sure. So I'm going to maybe tackle a couple of those. We have added about 8, so I won't get into all of them, but I'll get into a few. So we had some, for example, around early language. So because we were looking at affordable private schools, which are all in English, or what we call English medium schools over here, one of the expectations was that these children would be fluent and would be able to speak and communicate. So we added one question on simple spoken language, for example. We had a picture, which we borrowed from the SRI. And we asked children to tell us what was happening in the picture in a simple sentence. And we found that most children were not able to communicate even disjointed 2 or 3 words in English when they were asked to. So again, this was a picture that was very relevant to their lives, not out of context, local imagery. And the expectation was that they would give us 2 or 3 words strung together. We did something else with math and numeracy. So we actually had them do patterns as one of the skills. So we had them complete and continue patterns. And we found that while a majority were actually able to complete patterns, I think only 22 or 21% were actually able to continue a pattern. So wherever there's application, we're trying to figure out gaps in application, and that was another area that we found problematic. So yeah, those were some of the questions we added. We had something around reading simple 3-letter words, because again, they start grade 1 and they actually have textbooks across different subjects that they're expected to read. So could the child even decode simple 3-letter CVC words? And we again found a very small percentage could. So that's a glimpse into the questions. Our website does have the remaining ones as well as rationale put down. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. There was a question on methodology, but as one of our colleagues, Jonathan, noted, that's the type of question, if there are specific questions on how to conduct IDELA, that is a great, community of practice would be a great forum. But there is a question for Lauren and for others who would like to comment on looking into the big spread of the skill and age, and seeing why what are the implications for that, especially when we're thinking about measuring progress against the SDG goal. And then the second part of that is, there were any challenges in measuring social emotional outcomes?
Great, thank you, Renee. I will start speaking about the variation or the spread in scores, and then I think I'm going to turn the socio-emotional question over to Luke, because that was a big focus of their program in Serbia. But in terms of the spread of scores and what that means for measuring progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals, for me, it really highlights the need for continuing to assess children's learning and development. This idea that accessing services is an okay proxy for meeting SDG 4.2 is clear. It's clear that that's not enough. We really need to understand what children know and can do so that we can inform education systems. As Eva was showing that great diagram of the different resources that a system needs to invest in for early learning and for the early primary grades, we need to understand better what kind of curriculum changes need to be made, what kind of teacher training is necessary. I mean, can you imagine being a teacher in a classroom who has very limited training, for the most part, in these low and middle income countries, and you've got a child who, you know, really can't, doesn't have the expressive vocabulary to engage in a lot of activities. They maybe don't have the receptive language to engage in a lot of the activities. And then there's another kid who can do all of these things plus more and do problem solving. Like, the range of skills that you have in your classroom has got to be so overwhelming. So we really need to think about how to best support teachers and school systems to meet the needs of these kids, because I think what we're learning is that, especially in low and middle income countries, children have a greater diversity of backgrounds, of experiences that they've had before they get to a formal education system. And I think that's something that we're learning is a benefit of IDELA, that we can capture this variation in skills, because the tool is pretty broad compared to some of the other early learning and development tools that were developed in or used more in high-income countries that tend to be focused on one specific age group or one specific skill. And I think the assumption underlying those tools is more that kids have a more homogeneous experience before they get to an early learning setting, whereas kids in these lower income contexts really have a variety of experiences that they're bringing with them. And so using a tool that can capture all of those different skills and inform a system is really important. Luke, you want to speak a little bit about socio-emotional development?
Yeah, I'm happy to. There's actually a question in the Q&A, and then there's about what we do as practitioners to support socio-emotional development, and then there's a question in the Zoom chat here about how we measure it, because that seems really hard. So I'll try to just quickly address both. So in terms of what we do, our partners in Serbia do a ton of role-playing with parents. So I mentioned they have workshops with parents, workshops with kids, and then both. And I think, if you only have, a dozen or 24 interactions with kids, you might not make a ton of progress in developing their socio-emotional skills, but that same amount of time with parents, role-playing really hard ways to support your child's socio-emotional development, they found promising. And like I said, there were statistically significant differences between the socio-emotional development of the kids in the program and those not. In terms of measuring it, Lauren is certainly the expert, but I'll just speak in terms of somebody that's participated in the training and then led the training. The IDELA tool is actually really strong in this area. I think they've figured out a nice way to quote unquote quantify socio-emotional development in a way that doesn't leave too much room for bias from the enumerator. So for example, you might ask a child, how might you resolve a conflict? Okay, is there another way you could resolve that same conflict? And so in that way, it's pretty easy to measure. Certainly we have some issues with enumerators wanting to give bonus points for kids that are trying. So we train, and then we also on the back end do a enumerator bias test with our data, and that is something that certainly would recommend, just to make sure that there wasn't any. But this tool in particular, I think, does a really nice job of measuring that.
Awesome, thanks, Luke. Franny and Renee, do we have time for another question, or what do you think?
So we're at time, but we'll do one more, and this is more of a general one. I hope you all can hear me. So there's just great comments here about diversity. So I encourage you all, if you can, look through the chat. But so this is a general question about where the assessment was done. Was in home-based or ECD center setting, and then does that have any impact while we're looking at equity?
That's a good question. And I can say in each of these different contexts, even the panelists we have here, the IDELA assessment, I think, has happened in different contexts depending on the programming and where the children are. I mean, if it's a classroom-based setting, like for Gowry's example, I think that they were primarily focused on these ECE centers, then meeting children and sampling children at ECE centers was key. If you're in a more community-based program like Luke has been describing with his project in Serbia, you can choose to evaluate either in children's homes or at kind of central community locations to invite families and children. As Ali was mentioning also, if you are focused on specifically home-based programming, you could also reach kids in classrooms. Something that we tried to do with the IDELA assessment was make the materials and the load quite low for assessors so that you can take the assessment anywhere. You don't need a lot of props or different types of materials. We see a lot of IDELA assessment that happens under a tree, honestly, at different locations. So it can be administered anywhere, and it really depends on the need of the program.
Yeah.
Franny, we can't hear you. I can see you.
Okay.
Thanks.
I'm glad my enthusiasm came across.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry to cut off this discussion. I know that with these questions and with these panelists, we could go on for another hour or two. I want to assure you we've recorded all the questions, and if they were sent to an individual or asked of a certain individual and we haven't been able to answer them, I'm going to send them to that individual so they can respond to you. And the bigger ones that we think do deserve a greater discussion from a group are going to go onto our community of practice. The community of practice is being launched on our website next week, next Tuesday. Please throw a question in the chat box if you'd like to be invited and you haven't received that invitation. It did go out to a similar group that this invitation did, but we want to make sure that you're there. So this is going to be a new way for us to come together and talk about IDELA both on webinars and online. It's open to the public. We're really excited to share that with you. But that's another event. Thank you all for attending today. We are thrilled that we were able to have this discussion with so many participants and our fantastic panelists. Thank you to each of you for your time and for sharing your work with us. We greatly appreciate it. It's really added to our knowledge and discussion of the report.
Very good. While Franny's getting our last screen up with ways to contact us and the IDELA website, I just want to extend another thank you to our panelists for all their time and enthusiasm, and to everyone who's been engaging in the website since it launched, and for years before it launched. In some cases, like Allie's been with us since 2013. It's really amazing to see the growth and the energy and enthusiasm around early learning and support for the kids around the world. So from the bottom of my heart, thanks to everybody. It's really awesome.
Thank you all very much. I'm going to pause the recording here, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you.